This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with the COM 1000 course at the University of Connecticut. Here now is the host of Compendium, Professor Stifano.
Oh, it has been a little while since the last time we listened to that intro, and I stepped in to say hello to everybody listening. Hello again, and welcome to the very first episode of Season 2 of Compendium. I, as always, am your host, Steve Stifano, and I'm really excited to bring back the Compendium podcast for another year. So Season 2 will take us all the way through the 2015-2016 academic year, and we will continue our trend of talking to interesting researchers and interesting people about interesting things related to the field of communication. But we will be making some slight tweaks here and there along the way now that we've kind of had a season under our belt. Feedback was largely good for a lot of the interviews that we did in Season 1, so we will continue to try to bring you conversations with exceptional academics and exceptional people. We are working on a very interesting guest list for this entire academic year, and I'm quite proud of what we've got going on, and hopefully we can continue to build on it going forward. So I'm particularly excited to start this season off with a conversation with somebody who did not come through the pipeline here at the University of Connecticut, but instead is a senior scholar in the field of communication and really an expert on all things interpersonal, and particularly the details and nuances related to our relationships and our lives and our happiness. He's the author of a recent popular book. He's the author of several academic journal articles and books, and frankly, he brings a lot to the table. So without any further ado, I'd like to actually go ahead and get into this conversation with our first guest of the 2015-2016 academic year, Season 2 of Compendium, Professor Kory Floyd. We've had a great conversation, so let's go ahead and take a listen. So my guest today is a professor of health and family communication at the University of Arizona and author of the recent book, The Loneliness Cure. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Dr. Kory Floyd.
It's great to be here.
All right, thanks for joining us today. I know you've got a very busy schedule. He's visiting here at the University of Connecticut, and he's taken some time out to chat with us. So let's get right to it. So we ask every guest, first and foremost, where were you born?
I was born in Seattle and grew up in a small town about an hour south of there. And when I say small, I mean small. There were 50 kids in my high school class.
Well, that is a small town. So you went through school. At some point or another, you were introduced to this lovely field called communication. What was your first experience that you could call a communication experience in terms of academia?
Well, I sort of found it by happenstance. I wasn't a communication major as an undergraduate, and it was when I was looking for graduate school opportunities that I came upon the catalog at the University of Washington and began thumbing through it. Mm-hmm. And somehow I came to the communication department list of classes and started reading the descriptions and got very excited about the fact that people actually teach classes and study the kinds of things that I now do for a living. I was quite amazed by that. And so that's how I found my way to the discipline.
So many people seem to, who are in this field, seem to have that experience, that moment where you go, I can study this? I can actually do this? This is something I can do?
I had no idea, right.
And it's important to point that out, especially for the students who are listening, because I think, a lot of students will come in this office and sit in that seat right there and say, I didn't even realize you could take a class in this. And you
That's
say,
right.
Yeah, you can, and there's a lot to learn. So it's just funny to see that we've all kind of had that background. So after that, when did you kind of cross over to a point where you said, I want to do this more, rather than just kind of, an exposure to it, an initial introduction to it? When did you say, this is what I want to do with my career?
It took about 3 weeks, and that was about it. My very first graduate course was a seminar in interpersonal communication. And about 3 weeks in, I realized that this was amazing. It was so interesting. It was so invigorating to learn about personal relationships in the ways that I was, that even though I hadn't necessarily started graduate school with the goal of getting a PhD and working as an academic, I realized that that's what I wanted to do within the first month of graduate school. And so I went to my professor and asked, what do I need to do to get your job, basically? And he said, well, spend the next 6 years in school and get a PhD. And I was interested enough that I knew that I just had to do that.
It's funny, you were undeterred, as so many, because the first reaction when somebody says, how do I become a professor, is often kind of a, well,
how much time do you have?
Exactly.
Right. No, it just was one of those things where I was too interested not to do it. Right. I was too hooked on the idea of studying relationships and studying communication to know that that was a career path and not follow it. I think I always would have regretted deciding not to commit the time and the energy it took to go to graduate school in order to be able to do what I do now.
Yeah. Well, and you're clearly very passionate about it. And just, 2 questions in, if the body of work that you've put together thus far in your career isn't an indication, which it certainly is, 2 questions in, I think it's obvious that you really did love it right from the get-go and you did jump into it. So can you do us a favor and kind of give us an overview of kind of where you came from theoretically in terms of your work, what you were exposed to first that kind of got you into this, and where your research has headed from there? Can you kind of overview your work?
Well, I think like a lot of academics, I study things that have been impactful for me as an individual. And for me, one of those things is the communication of affection in close relationships. So I grew up in a very affectionate family. And when I was probably an adolescent, I discovered that even though that was my background, it wasn't everybody's background. And I quickly realized that even though I associated being affectionate with other people with very positive emotions, not everybody receives it that way. Right. Some people are quite put off by people who are very expressive or effusive with their emotions. And I was always quite puzzled by that. I could never figure out, why would you not want affection in your life? That seems so counterintuitive to me. And yet I was clearly seeing that situation come up in my own social experiences. And so when I went to graduate school and realized that there were tools I could use to study that question, that was my hook into what has then become my program of research, was to take the theories and the methods that I learned as a communication scholar and apply them to basically this grand question that had always really confused me. And when I was a PhD student, I remember a professor saying that it's not what you find curious, it's what you find confusing that really drives many of the most prolific researchers. And I thought, well, that certainly corresponds to my experience. It's been trying to unravel this mystery of how people react to and respond to affection in quite different ways that has driven a lot of my curiosity as an academic.
Interesting. So you've obviously done a lot of work on this, and it's nearly impossible in a half an hour to talk about, everything. But what's the best answer you've gotten yet?
Well, I really have come to understand that affection carries some very evident risks as well as rewards. And I think what puzzled me earlier in my life is that I was focused only on the rewards of it and not the fact that it can make people feel very obligated, sometimes obligated to respond in kind when that may not necessarily be their inclination. If I tell you that I care about you or I love you, there's a strong expectation of reciprocity for a behavior like that. And so if you don't say it back to me, that seems very awkward. It makes both of us feel uncomfortable. But if you say it back to me only because you feel obligated to, then that leaves you feeling very uncomfortable as well. And I recognize that I can place you in that obligatory position, even without meaning to. Even if my intentions are very positive, it can end up having a negative effect. So much so that when we receive expressions of affection from people that we don't want, it actually produces a stress response. And not just a psychological stress response, it produces a physical stress response. In the body, we react as we would to any other stressful situation. And I've just found that to be quite fascinating, a behavior that we often associate with such positive emotion can actually have very detrimental effects on the people who receive expressions that they're not open to.
Certainly. And, when we talk about relationships and anxiety, one thing I think of when you talk about that is how a very anxious person, we'll just say, kind of in a dual way, an insecure person might say, I love you, as sort of a check or a mitigation of the anxiety they're feeling in a relationship.
Absolutely.
Which might be an indication of exactly what you're talking about, how it's not always this perfectly wonderful thing to give affection.
Absolutely. And we've discovered even that people can use affectionate expressions for very manipulative purposes. So I think about a young child who comes up to his mother and says, Mom, I sure love you. And she looks down at him and says, what do you want? And moms understand that children know how to manipulate their parents because they know that affection is something that they want. And so if I give that to you as a resource, I can do that with ulterior motives. So one of the studies that we've done, this was years ago, but I wanted to find out how common this was for people to use affectionate expressions in a manipulative way. And so we surveyed college students around the country, a little more than 1,000 students in that study. And I asked them, have you ever done this? Have you ever expressed affection to someone that you weren't really feeling, but because you had some other motive in mind? And even I was surprised to find that nearly 90% of them said yes. And of that 90%, almost 2/3 of them had done so within the previous week. So it was very, very common, even more so than I expected.
And, it seems like the kind of thing that we often relegate to like primetime dramas or something.
Right,
You're going to use your affection for somebody, or sometimes more of a physical affection, to get somebody to do what you want them to do. But in reality, it seems like something that's a more common practice than we'd like to think.
Now, the good news is that not all of the motives that people have are self-centered.
Right.
So sometimes people would say that, well, I expressed affection because I felt like that's what they needed to hear at the time, or I wanted to comfort them because of a situation that they were going through. And then, of course, some of the motives are very self-centered. I wanted to have sex with the person. I wanted them to do me a favor. I was trying to get them to loan me money, things like that.
Yeah. So it shows how, and I think we often start our research with questions that come from our personal background to a degree, something we care greatly about, things that trouble us, confuse us.
Right.
But we also then learn, just like our students, I think, learn a lot of times, there's always another side to the story, another angle of attack to think about that
Many other
concept.
sides.
Yeah, many other sides.
As it turns out. And to me, the interesting thing about using affection in a manipulative way is not how common it is so much, but why is it effective? So why can I get somebody to do a favor for me if I tell them that I love them? And I think that it really comes back to the idea that to some extent and in some way, we all need a measure of affection in our lives. It becomes a resource like food or water or sleep that we thrive when we get enough of. And not everyone needs the same amount of food or water or sleep. Not everyone needs the same amount of affection. But we all need some. And so when we receive that from other people, it is a resource that we're willing to trade in exchange for.
So it sounds related to what you talk about in your book, which we'll get to in a minute, called affection hunger. Is that very much a related idea?
Well, I think it really is. I liken it to real hunger in that I need to have a certain amount of food because I need a certain amount of nutrients to intake every day in order to stay alive, in order to thrive. I need a certain amount of sleep, and I need a certain amount of connection to other people. We're a very social species as humans.
Certainly.
And so we don't just prefer, we don't just enjoy intimate connections with others. I think we really absolutely need some measure of it. And so that when that need goes unfulfilled, we hunger for affection in the same way that we hunger for food.
So this brings us to your book, and I think it's a good point to talk about it. So you've written this book recently called The Loneliness Cure. So I have a two-part question for you. What motivated you to write it? And I have a suspicion you've kind of danced around that idea already today. And then what is your central premise in the book? Because I think loneliness and affection obviously seem very closely related.
They are very closely related. I think my motive for writing this particular book was that I have been playing with these ideas for quite some time, in an empirical way and in a theoretical way, but I've never written a book for a public audience before. Mm-hmm. And yet I think that this is a message that resonates quite widely with people. I've had a number of people since the book came out, or even before it came out, as I would talk about the ideas in it, say, you're describing my life. This is exactly what I feel on a daily basis, which is that I wish I could get my husband, wife, children, parents, whomever, to be more affectionate with me. I almost hunger for a greater level of affection in my life. And it turns out that that's a more widespread experience than even I realized. And it really has a very strong connection with experiences like loneliness. Mm-hmm. So the central premise of the book is that we, as I said a moment ago, need a certain amount of affection, intimacy, connection, whatever we choose to call it, in our lives, in the same way that we need a certain amount of food. We need a certain amount of sleep. And so we thrive when those needs are met. And we experience detriments when they aren't. So if I don't get enough sleep, that certainly has impairments to my ability to function at an optimal level. Or if I don't get enough food, I very quickly begin to feel the negative effects of that. And it turns out that the same is true for affection when people are deprived of the level of intimate connection that they need and want from others. They feel very negative effects of that, like loneliness, mm-hmm. like experiences of social isolation. And as I talk about in the book, these aren't just detriments to our psychological experience as human beings. They have a number of physical problems associated with them as well. Mm-hmm. So things like loneliness and affection deprivation end up being associated with experiences like disrupted sleep or a compromised immune system, so mm-hmm. a compromised ability to ward off illness or to recover when you're ill. Loneliness is associated with a wide swath of very negative coping mechanisms: drug abuse, alcohol abuse, gambling, indiscriminate sexual activity, a number of things that help people fulfill their social needs in a momentary way,
right,
but have a number of long-term problems very much associated with them.
So it's interesting as we talk about this, because it seems like people, our culture, our society has been inundated with a whole host of new ways to seemingly mitigate loneliness in the past 10, 15 years.
Sure.
But by and large, a lot of these methods, which are mainly the internet mm-hmm. and related social media technologies and having thousands of friends or likes or page views or whatever your metric of the day is, it doesn't seem like it does enough to really mitigate that loneliness. And you talk about this a little bit.
It's social media and communication technology I think of as very much a dual-edged sword. Mm-hmm. They're not all bad. Mm-hmm. And I think that sometimes it's easy to dismiss them as the cause of everything that's wrong in the world right now. And I certainly don't think that at all. I think that these are tools like any other. And people were all up in arms when the telephone was invented. There were many of the same fears being broadcast in the media about how this is going to be the end of civilization as we know it, because people won't go visit each other anymore. And so we really see the same kinds of arguments being regurgitated here with things like Twitter and Facebook and the very easy ways that it has made for us to communicate and create and maintain connection in our lives. On the one hand, I think it definitely has the benefit that perhaps we are even communicating more because it's so easy, because it's so accessible. Where I worry about it is in the quality of the communication, not the quantity of it, mm-hmm. but the quality of it, because these modalities, almost by definition, privilege a superficial type of communication. So I have only so many characters in a tweet, right? And that really, by definition, precludes me from interacting with others in any kind of depth. It's all very superficial, and when that becomes my primary modality for communicating, I lose some of the skills, or I can lose some of the skills that I think are really necessary to form relationships that go beyond the superficial. And so I think it's okay if I have a number of superficial relationships if I also have those ones that aren't.
Right.
But my concern is that it's going to be easier and easier for us never to develop the depth in some close relationships that we need. So whereas our entire relational landscape becomes superficial, that's my concern.
Well, I was teaching a social media class a couple of years ago with seniors, and they were talking about the rush. We talk about physiological reactions.
Right.
They talk about the rush of getting a notification, just seeing that little badge with the 1 on it, and
Right.
saying somebody wants to talk to me, or somebody tagged me in something, or whatever it might be. And I wonder if with technology developing to a point where we now have smartphones and smartwatches and all these applications and all these different means of connecting, and that's in air quotes, if we now have a almost constant flow of these mini rushes, and it's keeping us from the mental energy, the physical energy necessary to actually cultivate a long-term successful relationship or relationships to have the kind of fulfillment that you're talking about.
It's quite interesting that people would have as you call it, a rush experience to getting a like or getting a friend request. Because again, I think of it as akin to the rush I used to get when I received a letter in the mail.
Yeah.
Or when the phone rang and it was for me. That was a huge rush as well. And to me, I see all of those as related fundamentally to our need as social beings to belong.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I would react positively to an indicator of inclusion or an indicator that someone is interested in me, because it feeds what is a very primitive need in me to be included, to be part of a larger social community. Psychologists refer to that as our need to belong. Right. And I think that has very deep evolutionary roots. So it's in no way unique to Facebook. It's in no way unique to social media or even communication technology writ large. It's just a different instantiation of that.
Yeah.
The same kind of rush that you and I got when we were children.
Right.
From very different modalities.
Yeah, certainly. And, and the landscape continues to change. And I always say this to students when they worry, and we end up inevitably in certain classes and certain conversations, sometimes in the office, having that point where a student says, so are we just doomed? Are we done? And we've never been done. We always seem to find ways to adapt to, as you said, the tools that are around us and the modalities that we have. But of course, there are some things that put different kinds of strains on us. And your mention of the quantity over quality approach to so many of these technologies is really worth acknowledging. So let me ask you the most unfair question I can possibly ask you.
Please.
What is the loneliness cure?
That's a good question, not an unfair question. I think that the real answer to that is that there are loneliness cures, plural. Not everyone who feels lonely or disconnected for the same reasons. And so just like you and I could go to the same doctor with a very different set of symptoms and expect that doctor to prescribe a very different set of treatments, I think that people who feel lonely and isolated for different reasons require different kinds of approaches to that. For some of us, it is as simple as making the effort to create a broader and deeper and more authentic, perhaps, relational experience than we are called to do in our daily Twitter inundated life. I think for some people, it's a matter of recognizing expressions of affection that they receive already that they're overlooking. And this is an interesting point because very often we are privy to or pay attention to the kinds of connections and the kinds of affectionate communication in our lives only that fits our very narrow parameters for what constitutes connection.
Right.
Whereas I may be receiving lots of interest, lots of affection from other people that I'm simply not aware that I'm receiving. And if I can broaden my own mind to be cognizant of that, then suddenly I feel a lot less lonely. For some people, the cure is not accepting every single offer of affection that comes along, because one of the things I detail in my book is that not every single offer is genuine. Some of them have ulterior motives, and some of them are very insincere. And so paradoxically, getting more affection in my life sometimes means turning down offers of affection when they have strings attached. So I think it's not a one-size-fits-all cure. I think it's a matter of perhaps correctly diagnosing the problem and then deciding which treatments best fit.
So is it safe to say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I'm thinking of when you say this is it safe to say that the cure is certainly cures, but it starts with some high degree of self-awareness when it comes to these relationships?
I think it has to. Yeah, I think that loneliness isn't the kind of experience that happens on its own. It's almost always a byproduct of decisions, either my own decisions and or the decisions of people around me that lead to a state in which I find myself feeling lonely. And so, as with any other condition, I think it has to begin with some healthy self-reflection. And with self-reflection that's very open-minded. So I have to be open to the possibility that to some extent I have made decisions that have contributed to the very problem I'm dealing with right now. It can't be a situation in which I'm only looking for the blame to fall on other people. Because we all make our own choices as social beings, and some of what is necessary to correctly diagnosing a problem is recognizing the things that I did to get myself here. And I think that can be very, make people feel very vulnerable in that process, but I also think it can be very empowering, because once I figure out what has led to the state I'm in right now, that gives me a much clearer picture of what I need to do to get out of that.
And I think that's one thing that we excel at in this field is if anything, if there's a central theme, it's that idea of being aware of the choices we're making and the communication we're engaging in and the behavior that we're engaging in. And I think that's very helpful. So my last question about the book, because we are a little bit short on time, would be, what did you learn while writing The Loneliness Cure?
Well, I learned even more so that this is a situation that people find very easy to relate to, much more so than I realized. And in the process of writing it, in the process of formulating the ideas, I really learned, and it came home to me, the idea that that there are many pathways out of that state. There's not just one single cure, but many ways to treat loneliness. And that the important part is not that I pick one strategy over the other. It's that I do something to help meet my need to belong.
And that's a great piece of just advice onto itself. And a lot of times, I think of the old Churchill quote, when you're going through hell, keep going, you know, and the idea that, there are just some times where we tend to fall into this state of paralysis with whatever situation we're facing, whether it's, emotional, social, et cetera, or emotion-social. And I think that sometimes you do have to just do something. You have to address what you're feeling, what you're dealing with in some way, shape, or form. And if that doesn't work, you need to try something else.
That's right, because sometimes by acting, even if you're not on the right course to begin with, it makes other courses evident to you that you didn't see at first. And so action and movement can have a very serendipitous effect in that way.
And that's really an inspiring note to leave that on, because the idea that the book topic is loneliness, but it really is motivational in a sense. It's find what works for you and get going on that.
That's right. Loneliness doesn't have to be a permanent state of being.
Right. And I think that's wonderful and inspiring. And I imagine that undoubtedly someone will listen to this podcast who's feeling that way, and that message will come through. And,
I hope so.
And I hope a number of our listeners actually go ahead and actually take the time to read this book, because it sounds like a fantastic topic. It sounds like a fantastic investigation. So I'm really excited, and I'm excited that you've come on with us. So I've got two more questions for you as we end every interview here on Compendium. The first would be, if you were to come into an intro-level comm course like our COM 1000 with 400 students in the lecture hall, and you were going to teach just one lecture, what would that lecture be from everything you have experience in or have taught in the past?
It would be about why learning good communication skills is so important to them, as human beings, and not from a superficial standpoint, but from a very deep evolutionary standpoint, that belonging and social inclusion are absolutely needs for us, and communication skills are a pathway to achieve those.
And that would be a fantastic lecture. We try to hit upon those ideas, but it's always nestled because of the nature of college classes.
Of course.
It's always nestled within other topics, some of which are superficial to a big degree. So I actually think our students would love that. And my last question, and it relates to our students as well. They're listening, and I imagine some of them probably are thinking, I wish I could ask him something, or I wish he could tell me what to do with my situation. If you could give just one piece of advice to young communication students in general, what would that be?
I only get one piece of advice to give them?
Unfortunately, you only get one. Well, you can fit in two if need be.
You know, I think that my advice would be similar to my lecture, which is that realizing that communication is a skill. It's not an innate ability. We're born with the ability to learn how to communicate, but it is a skill like music, like athletics, anything like that you have to learn. And just because you communicate every day doesn't necessarily make you an expert in it, doesn't necessarily make you good at it.
Right.
So be open to the possibility that there are things for you to learn that you can benefit from in a course like Introduction to Communication.
And it's great, and it's useful advice, and frankly, it's been a wonderful conversation. Dr. Kory Floyd, the author of The Loneliness Cure, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today. Thank you so much for
It's been great.
Coming on Compendium, and we look forward to seeing your work going forward in the future, because we know you're very busy.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Kory.
So there you have it, our conversation with Professor Kory Floyd. His most recent book, titled The Loneliness Cure, available now and on sale. And he is fortunately gracing us with his presence here this week at the University of Connecticut. We thank him for taking the time to sit down with us here on Compendium. And once again, this is just the first of many episodes that we will be putting out here in Season 2. We've got a lot more guests to talk to, a lot more conversations to have on a wide range of topics related to the field of communication. So hopefully you will continue to join us. Check back soon for Season 2, Episode 2. And in the meantime, hopefully all is well on your end, and we look forward to talking again soon. I'm Steve Stifano. Take care and have a great day. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and his guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut, the UConn Department of Communication, or the COM 1000 course itself.